I am not a musical man. 38 years measuring load-bearing walls and calculating dead weights will do that to you. By the time I retired I could tell you the tensile strength of any bolt in the south of England, but I couldn't have told you the difference between a sonata and a serenade if my pension had depended on it. My wife Marion tried, bless her. She dragged me to the Heartborn Civic Concert Series every autumn for 11 years, and I sat in the velvet seats with my program folded in my lap and waited, patiently and without shame, for the interval drinks. So I want you to understand, when I tell you what happened that Friday evening in the Old Pier Theatre, that I am not a man who is easily moved by music. I am a man who knows what a structure can bear. And I am telling you that what I heard that night nearly buckled something in me that I had assumed was solid. The Heartborn Pier Theatre Restoration Gala was a black-tie affair for about 70 of us, local councillors, a handful of business people, a couple of faces I recognized from the Regional Arts Board, and assorted friends of the building. The theatre had been closed for 6 years by then, the ironwork on the seaward end going, the plasterwork in the upper circle streaked with damp. The Friends of the Pier had been fundraising for 3 years to get the place back, and this was their centerpiece evening: champagne, a string quartet booked for the second half, canapes that were mostly pastry, and a great deal of polite standing about. I was there because my old colleague Bernard Ashby was treasurer of the Friends Committee and had been badgering me for 2 months to come and show my face. I had shown my face. I was on my second glass of something sparkling and was admiring, in a professional way, the restored cornice work above the stage when I first noticed the piano. It was a Bechstein grand, old but clearly maintained, sitting stage left with its lid half raised. And beside it, not touching it, not even particularly looking at it, was a small woman in a dark blue dress. She was perhaps late 70s, white-haired, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had done physical work all their life, and she was holding a glass of orange juice and looking out toward the back of the stalls with the uncomplicated air of someone who had come to enjoy the evening and was doing exactly that. I would not have registered her particularly, except that I noticed, a moment later, that she had laid one hand very gently on the closed fallboard of the piano, the way you might lay a hand on the shoulder of someone you hadn't seen in a long time. I learned later, from Bernard, that her name was Winifred Blatch, Winnie, everyone called her, and that she had been the head cook at Heartborn Primary for 31 years, serving her last lunch in 2009. She had come to the gala because her neighbor, a younger woman on the Friends Committee, had a spare ticket and thought Winnie might enjoy the theater. It was the first time Winnie had been inside the building in 40 years. Aldous Prentice spotted her roughly 10 minutes before the program was due to begin. Prentice was the evening's guest of honor, a concert impresario of some national standing, apparently, though I knew nothing of him then. He was a large, well-fed man with silver hair that had been arranged with care, and he moved through the room with the comfortable authority of someone who had been applauded for long enough that he no longer noticed it. He was holding a glass of champagne and talking loudly to the chair of the arts board when the sound engineer appeared at his elbow to tell him there was a problem with the microphone line on the stage and they would need 12 minutes to sort it before the string quartet could set up. Prentice turned. His gaze swept the room in the manner of a man accustomed to solving logistical problems without inconveniencing himself, and it landed on Winnie, and on the piano, and on her hand resting on the fallboard. "You play," he said across the room, louder than was strictly necessary. Winnie looked up. "A little," she said. Prentice waved his champagne glass in the direction of the stage with the particular generosity of a man who is doing someone a favor he hasn't fully considered. "Wonderful. Give us something simple, just a little tune to fill the gap while we sort the sound. Nothing fancy. Keep it cheerful." There was a ripple of something in the room. Not unkindness, exactly, more the mild, reflexive amusement of a crowd that has correctly identified what kind of moment this is. A few people smiled. The woman beside me murmured something to her husband. Prentice had already turned back to his conversation. Winnie looked at the piano for a moment. Then she set her orange juice down on the nearest table, with the same unhurried care she had used for placing the hand, and she walked to the bench. I watched her because I had nothing else to watch, and because there was something in the quality of her movement that held me. She didn't hurry, and she didn't hesitate. She reached the bench and stood beside it for a moment, then turned the height knob 3 full turns, not fumbling, not checking, just 3 turns, as if she had calculated it before she left the house. She sat. She placed both hands in her lap. She looked at the keys for perhaps 4 seconds. Then she raised her hands and played the first note. I want to try to explain what happened to the room, and I know I am not equipped to do it properly, but I will try. The note was single, one note, the opening of whatever she was about to play, and it was not loud. It was, if anything, gentle. But it had a quality I can only describe the way I would describe a structure: it was load-bearing. It carried something. And before the note had finished sounding, the conversation in the room had stopped. Not wound down. Stopped. As if someone had reached into the air and switched something off. I have been in buildings when they go quiet and buildings when they go silent, and they are different things. Quiet is the absence of noise. Silence is when the room is listening. This was silence. 70 people, glasses halfway to mouths, standing in the silence that this woman's first note had made. She played. I found out the name of the piece afterward: Liszt, a study on sospiro, which I'm told means a sigh. I would have called it something else, if I'd had to name it. I would have called it a conversation between the left hand and the right, a melody that kept crossing from one to the other, arching over itself like a bridge that spans without a single straight line, always in the air, never quite resolved, always reaching. As a structural proposition it would have been impossible. As music, it was the most coherent thing I had heard in my life. She played without sheet music, without looking at her hands. Her eyes were open but not, I think, seeing the stage or the stalls or the 70 of us arranged like stopped figures in a room. She was seeing something else. The music rose and turned and fell and rose again, and she followed it or it followed her, and I could not have told you which. I became aware, somewhere in the middle of it, that the woman beside me was crying. Not making any sound, she had one hand pressed flat against her sternum and her eyes were full, and she was making no attempt to hide it or apologize for it. I looked away, because it seemed right to look away, and found that I was looking at Aldous Prentice. He had not, I think, meant to be watching. He had been mid-sentence with the Arts Board chair when the first note landed, and he had turned, as we all had, and then he had not turned back. He was standing with his champagne glass lowered to his side, and the champagne was listing gently against the rim, and his face, I am a man who has spent his career reading structures for the things they cannot say aloud, looking at a wall and knowing where the stress has been, where something has shifted imperceptibly over years, his face was entirely altered. The authority had gone out of it. He looked, if I am honest, like a man who has said something stupid in a room and cannot unsay it, except that the thing he had said was 12 minutes ago and the room had long since moved past it and would not be coming back. He took one step backward and found the wall behind him and stayed there. The music did not hurry to its end. It took its time the way a tide takes its time, the way anything that has been saved for a long time is spent slowly when it finally comes. There was a passage near the end that seemed to gather itself, the left hand and the right converging, the melody drawn up into something that my chest registered before my mind did, a compression and then a release that I felt in my sternum, and then the final notes descended, one by one, like something being set down very carefully, and the last chord was held until the room had it fully, and then the hands lifted. The silence lasted longer than any silence in my experience of public spaces. Then Bernard Ashby, in the third row, stood up. He did not start applauding immediately. He simply stood, and the woman beside me stood, and in the way of these things, the rest of the room stood with them, row by row and cluster by cluster, and then the applause began, and it was not polite applause, it was not the applause of an audience doing what is expected of it. It was the sound 70 people make when they have had something returned to them that they did not know they were missing. Winnie sat for a moment longer on the bench after her hands had lifted. Then she placed them in her lap, pressed them together lightly once, and stood. She gave the room a single nod, not a bow, a nod, the gesture of someone who has done a job well and knows it and does not require a great deal of ceremony around the fact, and she walked back to where she had left her orange juice. I worked my way across to Bernard during the interval, while the string quartet were setting up and Prentice was nowhere to be seen. "Who is she?" I said. I had asked this already, but I needed to ask it again. Bernard told me what he knew: Winnie Blatch, Hartborn Primary, head cook, 31 years. He told me she had come as a guest of her neighbor, Constance, on the committee. Then he paused and said that Constance had mentioned something, once, about a piano in Winnie's front room, a battered upright, and that Winnie had apparently played it every week for as long as anyone could remember, alone, with the door closed. "Never played for anyone?" I said. Bernard shook his head. I looked across the room. Winnie was talking with Constance near the back wall, and she was laughing at something, and she looked exactly as she had looked when I first noticed her, uncomplicated, warm, like someone who had come to enjoy the evening and was doing exactly that. She was holding the orange juice. I found myself standing beside her 20 minutes later, without quite having planned it. I said something inadequate about the music, in the way of non-musical people, and she smiled at me and said thank you. What was it? I said. The piece. She told me, and I stored the name carefully. Then she said, and she said it quietly, in the same way I imagine she said everything, with no particular drama attached, that she had learned the piece 40 years ago, and that she had played it once before in front of anyone. Once. In the October of 1987, at the hospital in Canterbury, in the last hours of her husband Frank's life. She had asked the ward sister if there was a piano, and the ward sister had thought she was confused by grief, and then had gone to check, and there had been an old upright in the visitor's room at the end of the corridor. And Winnie had gone and played it, with the door open, for Frank, who could not see the piano but could hear it from his bed, and who could not by then speak, but whose hand, when she came back to him, was warmer than it had been. I always meant to play it for him properly, she said. In the sitting room, when he got out. He never got out. She lifted her orange juice. I kept it for him, after that. It didn't feel right to play it for anyone else. She said this the way she said everything, without apology, without weight, in the tone of someone simply accounting for the facts. Then she looked toward the stage, where the quartet were lifting their bows, and said she hoped the theater got its money. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing adequate. I drove home along the coast road that night with the window down and the sea air coming in cold, and I thought about tolerances. About what a structure can hold when it is built well, and for how long, and what happens when the load is finally, gently, set down. I thought about Frank Blatch, in the October of 1987, in a ward in Canterbury, hearing something through an open door. I had spent 38 years asking what buildings could bear. That evening, for the first time, I thought I understood the question properly.